Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Uncovered podcast. Really good to have you all. I'm here with my good friend Nick. How are you, sir?
I'm doing really, really well. Thank you, Femi. What about yourself?
I'm well, thanks, man. I'm really glad that you didn't, react to me actually giving you a nice intro because every single time I seem to give you a nice intro, it becomes the biggest deal. Like I'm not a nice guy, but that's all right. I'm glad that
You know
today you're
what?
getting used to it.
Yeah, you've been quite consistent for like the past 4 or 5 episodes. So at this point now, maybe I'm thinking it's the new you. So it's like, okay,
Thank
let
you.
me just
Thank
accept
you.
that.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a new me. I'm refined. I've been defined and refined.
As always,
And
we always are.
But today's episode is going to be sick, man, because I think that it's something that a lot of people have been asking us about. A lot of people have been wanting to know a little bit more about. And we have an expert in the field, right? And we're going to be talking and uncovering more about men's mental health because it's such a hard topic. It's so hard because we all know, guys all know, they're like, yeah, I probably should talk, right? I probably should. But how do I do that? What's stopping me from doing that? And obviously, as we can see in the disparity in how many people engage in mental health services, it's probably sitting around the 80-20 mark or even worse, right? So why is that? Why is that happening? So we've got an expert joining us here, men's mental health counselor expert, Mr. Howard. How are you, sir?
Well, it's very nice to be here, and it's thank you for the little intro. I don't know whether expert is always necessarily fits with the tag, but I've been working in the field for a while, and I'm also a bloke, so maybe that's part of the expert bit. But
No,
thank you for having me.
You got the Nick and Femi stamp of approval. You are now officially an accredited expert from the Nick and
Excellent.
Femi College
Beautiful. Thanks. That's what I've been waiting for. I've been waiting for this all these years.
It's a very prestigious one. People like we had this one guy that was like, "Do I want a Nobel Prize or do I want to be a Nick and Femi expert?" He said, "Why would I want a Nobel Prize?"
Right, obvious choice. Yeah.
Obvious, man. Come on.
That's
Awesome.
That's better. But Howard, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for connecting with us. I think this is going to be such an exciting podcast because we actually did one on men's mental health, like one of the first podcasts that we did when we were still new to it all, and it had such great responses, great reactions, and we didn't even delve into it as well as I think that we're going to right now. So I'm really, really excited to have this conversation. And I think the best way to kind of start is by talking about, I think everybody has an idea, kind of like what Femi mentioned, is about the relation to men, obviously being myself one and Femi, kind of is what we're thinking. No, kidding. But we know that men struggle to express their emotions. And obviously this is due to so many factors such as conditioning, false perceptions of emotions and all these kind of things. So how do we actually break this cycle?
What a big question. Let's start with the easy questions first, shall we? Then we'll go into. There's a few things. There's a few things that sort of come to mind. There's a few layers to the question. I think part of it, in my experience, when I look at part of my own life, but also the work that I'm doing with guys, and even some of the parenting work that I do with fathers, there is something about the way we maybe need to educate boys and kids generally, but certainly boys, in our school systems, how we support parents, to kind of coach boys particularly to understand their emotional health from quite a young age, really, so that there's a kind of environment that we know we grow up in, and that there are so many factors. Schooling is one, the family of origin is the other, our community, our peer group, and so on and so forth, even our sporting teams, our community kind of engagement activities that we do. But there is something about learning the language of emotional well-being from a very early age. So, emotional well-being is as much a skill as it is an awareness, but it has to start very young. And I don't know whether we're better at it. There are programs in schools now compared to where I was, 25, 30 or so years ago. There were resilience programs, but there is something for boys particularly to have a language at a fairly young age. And how do they learn? They only learn from their adults around them as much as their peers as they grow up. So part of it's education, I believe, in terms of kids and parenting. The other part of it, of course, is, even with adults, it's about a combination of adult education, skill development, and self-awareness. And there's a combination of things that I think men respond to much better than maybe women, which is learning skills, learning to have goals, having concrete steps to understanding their well-being, which is not the same as the fuzzy F word, which is the feeling word, which I think is a language that men don't always use. So, there's a few layers of looking back at how we learn these restrictive ways of coping. The work I do with men, I think, is a combination of awareness raising, psychotherapy, education, coaching. And the first step is usually guys who become aware that there's a need to understand themselves, or they get coached and supported by people around them that care about them to go and look for more understanding of their well-being. So it works, the entry point to well-being is self-awareness, or at least awareness of others. And I think that's kind of where the beginning points are.
Because I've got a couple of questions that I would love to take a step back, because that's a heavy question to start. But in terms of the difference between why women speak compared to men, what did you find was one of the big difference makers? Like, what was one of the barriers? What was the reason why men feel like, I can understand that, like, life's kind of going to shit, but how do I talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because it's sort of partly because it shows up in my room when I'm working with couples as well as with guys individually. But when I think back at my experience growing up, I think there's something in the research that says something about men's brains. I think we generally process a lot slower. So there is something in literally the way we get to kind of form our understanding of the world. So we don't talk that easily, and we haven't got the language to speak, and we're not even sure what we want to say. And there is something, this is like boxing too many men in, I suppose. I don't want to stereotype men and women. Women, in my experience, just know how to talk. They think quicker, they process quicker, they have language that's more sophisticated, and somehow they can talk quite well and quite quickly. And the problems associated with that for men is they get lost and they tune out. So if we're already disconnected from our own internal language, and then somebody who's with us is highly connected or highly able to process, then we get kind of lost and confused. So we're less likely to even engage. We'll disconnect. So that's kind of part of the differences that I see in the difference between men and women.
Yeah, wow. That's super fascinating, because I know for myself, and I think you touched on this in the beginning when you were talking about the first key to entry in any form of well-being is the self-awareness. Is when I was not aware of my emotions and how I was feeling, or even the need for me to even express, it was hard for me to be able to articulate to anybody. And I found myself constantly frustrated, because when I was asked about how I was feeling, I articulated poorly or incorrectly. And then people had a different notion or perception of what I'm trying to say, or how I am perceived as, which led to this perpetual cycle of me being like, oh, you're not understanding me. So I'm just not going to talk about it anymore, because I don't want you to have the wrong idea.
Right.
So I'm curious, in your kind of encounters when you are having these therapy sessions and counseling sessions with men, and whether this is their first time actually presenting, because I'm not sure, or they maybe haven't gained that awareness or not fully aware, how do you go about getting them to kind of extract or take that first step in eliciting information?
Well, the beauty for me, I think, is the men that come and see me, they kind of want to be there. They may be ambivalent. They may be a bit nervous and a bit scared. So when they come into the door, the interesting thing for me is I'm a bloke. I don't sit with a white coat and I'm not making notes. I don't work in that. I'm quite relaxed. It's fairly informal, but it needs to be inviting. So, and the first thing is making men feel comfortable in being a bit nervous and a bit unsure, and that we normalize it quite quickly. And then what happens really is, my invitation really to help men tell their story in whatever way it is. And telling the story can be a bit clumsy. It can be awkward. And in fact, that's what most men start with. I don't quite know what's going on. I know something's not right. I'm feeling irritable, or I'm withdrawing from my partner, or I'm not communicating very well, or I'm working too much, I'm drinking too much, or I'm escaping too much. And we very quickly kind of normalize those kind of experiences as being very common. And I often say to guys, if you could, watch a movie of all my therapy sessions with all the men that I work with, which you'll never be able to do, of course, but the themes around it are incredibly common. And it's to do with feeling uncomfortable, not having the language or the words, and being really confused in terms of what's actually going on. And pretty quickly, once you're allowed to create the space to talk, they'll start to feel relief. It's kind of okay to sit in a comfortable room in Hampton, Bayside, Melbourne, or Melbourne CBD, or wherever, or whichever therapy room it is, that you're allowed to speak about your own experience without judgment, without criticism, and even without a diagnosis, for that matter. For that, in many cases as well. I learned early on that if you create the right space, men will talk.
So how
if you create the
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's a bit like if you create the right podcast, men will listen. It's something that you're doing as much as what I'm doing, as much as other people are doing, that normalize and invite conversation without the judgment and without any kind of criticism.
So how do you get men to, is there a structure for telling this story? Like, how do you get men to actually say it? Because I think that, like you said, when people come to your side and they are comfortable, they've probably overcome a few hurdles to even get to you, right? But if you're sitting in your room, life is a little bit tough. How do you make sense of it and tell your story to yourself to be able to understand and articulate what you are kind of going through? What's the process? Or maybe not even to yourself, but to your spouse or to your friend or to whoever.
Well, there's a few things that I've learned, I think, over my time, and most people that do this kind of work have got their own backstories. So there's a bit of my backstory in this. Just very briefly, I'm not going into any sort of personal disclosure as such, but as a man growing up in a middle class household in the UK, which is where I'm from, very stoic family. So a lot of kind of good times, but no real emotional times as such. So there's a lot of silence around emotion. So I learned that early on. So there was no language, no real talking. Yeah, you had to be good and behave, but there's no real expression of language. So I at the very early stages of my 20s and 30s, I had no language for what I was feeling either, until I met somebody who said, you've got a bit of a problem. You don't talk enough. I don't know what you think and what you feel and what you need. I can't help you with that, but go and learn something about yourself. And I had never heard about this sort of stuff before. This was in my late 20s, early 30s. The process that I discovered that I now work with is a kind of step-by-step process. One is to create safety, to be in the right space with the right person. The other thing is to learn to connect with what you're in tune with in your experience of yourself. It doesn't have to be feelings or language. It could just be you're uncomfortable in your body, or you're kind of lost concentration, or you're not focused very well. So the first thing is to understand how to connect with your experience. And in therapy, what we do is I do a lot of breathing, a lot of slowing down with men, a lot of time to sit in silence and think, what is the possibilities of your experience right now? I'm irritable, I'm restless, I'm hot, I'm cold, and we slow the process down. And then we start to learn more about awareness of the internal story in our head. And often most men will start talking negatively about themselves. I'm not good enough, I haven't got the language, I'm an idiot, I'm emotionally retarded. That's a very common one. I can't speak. And so that's the internal story. And yet that internal story is preventing the opening of understanding and awareness of what it means to feel something. And so we start with connection, awareness raising, understanding language of emotion, where the backstory may be, how we learned about it, possibly, how to reflect on ourselves, how to diffuse the negative narrative, how we stop giving ourselves a hard time. And that's a kind of self-talk. It's a self-hate, but it's also a self-judgment. Men can be very hard on themselves. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you guys. We can be very tough on ourselves very quickly. We've learned that as we've grown up, really. But So we kind of diffuse the internal narrative that's not working. And then we start reflecting and values-driven work, and then we start engaging more a bit about, so how do we change the story in our head? And we do that in a process, really, of talking, but also learning to slow down and think about different ways of telling our story. And that's learning compassion, learning empathy, and learning how to accept our experiences emotionally and physically and maybe relationally. And that kind of takes a bit of time. We do a lot of experiential avoidance in our lives, all of us, not just men. We avoid the pain. we feel that that's what we're supposed to do. So we do everything we can not to feel or not to be in pain. And yet we know, as we know with the world right now, there's a lot of pain out there, a lot of struggle out there. But if we're suffering because we're not talking and learning, we stay in the suffering. So that's kind of the story that I often present to men, because it's so common in most men that I work with. And of course, that was my experience when I was partly in my younger life, that I was doing the same thing. I was escaping. I was doing everything I could not to feel anything. No one taught me how to do the language of emotions. So I did my own personal development work, my own therapy, my own supervision, my own training, and my own master's in my counselling psychotherapy degree, and learned to formalize my own personal experience. So there's an authentic relating that happens in therapy, which is really powerful.
Yeah. I think that's really, really beautiful. And like one of the first things that came to mind was just how you've heightened the power of emotional intelligence. And, even just relating back to your kind of story, I know for myself, I wasn't aware of any of my emotions growing up, because obviously I was taught that, expressing emotion is a sign of weakness as a man, and we're not designed to do that. We need to be providers. We need to show strength at all times. So that was my kind of conditioning of how to repress my emotions and not feel that. And, even for myself, when I reflect on my upbringing, I know that a very common emotion, though, that I was taught and I was able to kind of express freely and wasn't able to shy away from, was an expression of anger. I was like, you know what, it's okay for me to be angry, because that's fine, men do get angry. But what it did is that it actually taught me not to feel sad. And when I kind of reflected on hindsight, the reason I was angry was because I was sad. Yeah. So I'm curious, for any men that are listening to the podcast that might be in this same kind of situation, how do we feel that men go about processing this, or how do we regulate and get a better understanding of where I'm at in the emotional spectrum?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a couple of things. At the extreme end of anger, the purpose of anger is really interesting to think about. There's a few reasons why it happens. If we're really overwhelmed, and yet we're avoiding what we're really feeling, or we don't quite know what it is, and we're getting very, what we call flooded. So the brain's getting really hyper. We go into fight-flight mode. So anger is one of the fight modes. So if we're threatened by something, we'll go into that natural response. So anger and aggression is kind of very common for men when they first come into therapy, because they can describe their frustration, they describe their irritability and their mood and their aggression, and in some cases, anger. So we have to de-escalate anger first. So that is about regulating, learning techniques to stress management techniques, calming techniques, grounding techniques, and what have you. The other thing, though, which is probably, that's the high end of it, the most important part of this is, I think, the discovery of what I think is termed meta-emotion, which is a bit of a jargonistic term. I don't know if you've heard of meta-emotion or not. Comes out of some of the emotion theory research around what it means is the way we feel about the way we feel. And we learn that in our environment as we grow up. And we're taught, of course, men particularly, that sadness is not okay to have. So we don't want to have the feeling. So the more we have the feeling of sadness, we get more irritable about it, and more kind of grumpy about it and resistant to it. And eventually, of course, you will know, and I know, we get triggered by the expression of the anger instead. So, there's like a whole anger iceberg metaphor. I don't know if you know the iceberg metaphor is kind of interesting. Yeah. The iceberg is, 10% of an iceberg is above the waterline, 90% is below. And in terms of certain kinds of emotions, particularly for men, we're very good at describing being irritable and moody and restless and grumpy and maybe pissed off and angry. So we know we feel that. The chances are there are feelings underneath that we're struggling to identify or even accept. So when I teach men a broader, expansive terms of emotion and start to learn to recognize, if it's anger, probably I'm reacting to another feeling. So I need to diffuse the anger and think, what else is going on here? What is the language that I'm not kind of accessing in my own brain? Maybe I don't want to feel sad. We're not taught to feel sad. Most men say sadness is weakness, right? Or vulnerability in a broader sense is weakness. And the problem is, if we want to love somebody and be in a relationship with somebody, or we want to kind of like ourselves and, accept ourselves, we have to feel vulnerable. So if we're in this meta emotion struggle, I don't want to feel that. I'm resisting that. Then where do the feelings go? They'll go into behaviors and other kind of reactive ways of coping. So I think anger, whilst it's useful, it's also like a secondary response really to other primary feelings that are going on.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. I think that's really well said, because as men, our biggest issue is all about bottling up and not feeling the whole emotional spectrum, where either happy today or angry. There's not really much in between, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, really, I guess, like, my big thing is, like, we know that we should do this, and it's great that we have the awareness to be able to make that leap. But if you had to, probably a really hard question, but if you had to nail one thing, one strategy, one technique that someone could do really, really simply to help them stop bottling stuff up, or to help them start the process of feeling more and understanding what I'm actually responding to, what would you say? What do you do with your clients?
Okay, there's a few things. One is sitting in silence. Now, that's a kind of interesting idea. It's not necessarily meditating or anything, but in therapy, some of the most sort of useful kind of information that happens is when we're in silence for a little while, right? Not for the whole session, hopefully, 5 or 10 minutes. In people's lives, what I say to men is, if you go out into the world, even between therapy sessions, and you start finding moments where you're not just distracted by doing something all the time, but you just go for a walk. You don't you don't put your AirPods in or any music in. You just go for a walk for 20 minutes, half an hour, and you start to use your 5 senses in your experience of going for a walk. You will start to be amazed at what comes up in your own reflection of what you're thinking about. So you make space for your own reflection. We're so busy at distracting. So, some distractions obviously okay. We need to be doing things, and it's fine to go to the gym and work out. It's fine to play video games sometimes. It's fine to go and do all sorts of things. But if we're just sitting doing seemingly nothing, the brain itself will start to calibrate some kind of mental awareness. Now, we do it in therapy because it's safe to do so. So what happens is, I'll sit with somebody for 10 minutes. So it's like, just close your eyes and just breathe and just see what happens. And let's see if you can share what's going on, and we can talk a bit more about it. Or if you're starting to struggle with yourself and label yourself, then let's look at diffusing it in therapy. So it's quite experiential, but you have to create the safety to do so. I can't underestimate going for a walk on the beach or in the forest or in the park as a way of having to sit with or walk through the silence. We're so busy looking for the skill and for the solution that we can kind of trip ourselves up a little bit. So it's learning to trust the brain's organic way of creating a bit of space. And it sounds very simple. It is quite simple to do. It's just we sometimes don't choose to do it, So that's a really important thing about not bottling. It's becoming a bit more aware. What am I experiencing right now? What do I see? What do I hear? What do I smell? What do I taste even? What's it like being me in the moment? And you'll be amazed at what comes up. Good things, bad things, different things. Don't buy into anything of criticism. Just let it be, And it's a skill. It's a grounding skill, but it also stops us from being so distracted. So instead of bottling, learn to find safe space to see what comes up and see what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And most importantly, if what you're thinking, is that helping you, or is that serving you or not? And then we open up all sorts of possibilities there.
That's really true, because I think that you nailed it, right? Like, in terms of sitting in that silence and sitting in that stillness is very against the grain for a lot of men. Because we're constantly searching for the tangibility in something, the skill, the next step, the improvement, the incremental changes, rather than actually slowing down. I think when you said that, I think that really resonated with me in a lot of areas, in terms of like, I want to see something come out of this, right? Like, I'm not trying to just feel, like I want to see something come out of it. And it's confronting, because it's like my whole life and my whole, like, everything that we do is all about emotions and feelings. But even as a man, I'm still having so many of those moments where I'm like, I want to see a tangible result. Like a real tangible result.
Well, it's a good question, because the expectation is really important. But if you go for a walk for half an hour, generally speaking, you'll start to brush away the cobwebs. When you come into therapy with somebody, after about, hopefully, a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, you start to feel relief. So relief is actually an outcome. Clarity becomes an outcome. The capacity to breathe becomes an outcome. And then maybe you'll start to pick some steps up in terms of solution. I need to do this more often. I need to slow down more often. I need to find space to do some good reflection without being busy on YouTube or watching too much TV. These are all, they're all solutions. They're all steps, It's learning to trust the space in between distraction, solution, and process. And that has to be about slowing down first. I mean, we know to meditate's good. Meditation's good for you. Exercise is good for you. Playing with your kids is great for you. Talking with your partner is brilliant for you. Learning a skill and a hobby is good for you. All those things are really good. And I always encourage that for to be the case for men, to have a balance of their own lives. But this is more about learning to be with your own brain and your own mind. There is a process involved in that. You can do that listening to a good podcast. You can do it reading a good book. You can do it by doing a workshop, attending a workshop. You can go into therapy. There are plenty of options that men can actually do. But I think it's really about learning more about your own brain. And that's not easy. I know it's not easy, because our minds are really complex,
Yeah, 100%. That's so fascinating. So I'm just curious, because I know that, like, mindfulness is a practice that we try to encourage people to do on a daily basis. And obviously their mindfulness routine can be, it can be for 1 minute, it can be for 5 minutes, it can be for 15 minutes. It's dependent on the individual, which is really, really important. And I know that with meditation, even when I first started doing meditation, I was expecting a result and outcomes come off the back of the meditation. But what you're saying, which was the beauty of it, organic thoughts that I was then able to process and just let it kind of just ponder in my mind. But I know what you're talking about, sitting in silence, is a little bit different to the meditation. So would you recommend people integrate that part of their routine daily, or how should people be doing that?
I reckon it's both. I mean, I've often, when I teach some mindfulness skills in therapy, I'll say do it 5 minutes a day. But it's a good question. It's about expectation. What do you think is going to happen when you do 5 minutes of meditation or mindfulness? There's a number of things that can happen. But if we attach ourselves to the outcome, we're already expecting something to happen, and we may or may not be lucky enough for it to happen. So the idea really is looking at what it really means. And honestly, it's learning to observe our mind. It's learning to step back and look. It's learning to look at what is happening within us without judgment. And that does take practice. 5 minutes a day is a good start. 20 minutes a day is brilliant. Going for a walk in the park, you can do it mindfully. I remember doing a 10-day meditation retreat in silence about 20 years ago. Literally 10 days, learning a technique but not talking to anybody. And how people often talk about the monkey mind and what's going on in the mind and in the body. And it takes quite some time to just trust, to watch and observe, without buying into any particular narrative or judgment or story. But that takes practice. So 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day. And then we start to regulate, and the brain starts to get used to slowing down, which is amazing. But it's a skill. That the outcome is you learn to be with yourself. If you're lucky, you'll feel more relaxed, a bit calm. If you're even more lucky, you can observe the frustration without buying into the judgment.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's beautiful. And I think that, even for myself, listening to this again, like it's such a great refresher for myself, to be able to kind of understand and be like able to put things into practice for my own life and for my own mental health, because the outcome is like, I was always attached to the outcome purely.
Yeah.
And then when I didn't receive that outcome, it demotivated me to want to continue. So just that little separation in terms of what is the actual outcome is so essential. And I think
it's huge.
Valuable for anybody that's listening.
And I'm still learning, by the way. I'm still learning it. I'm still doing it. But I also, I trip myself up and think, I want to do 10 minutes to relax, and then my mind's going off in all sorts of places. So it's an ongoing progress, I think, really.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So what I want to kind of do now is that we've been speaking a lot about emotions and men's mental health in general, but I want to kind of move it on to a specific topic about men and relationships. And I think this is fascinating because we get a lot of questions in relation to this. Even myself being in a relationship as well, I kind of struggle with this as myself on a daily basis. And I think one of the common things that I hear a lot about is that people would be in a long-term relationship for such a while with their partner, maybe got onto marriage or whatever. And then suddenly, there's been like a transition where the partner's like, you know what, I need to take a break, or, I don't think this is working. And it's come at a big surprise.
Yeah.
So why do you think that's the case? Is there something that as men, and maybe this could be going back to the emotional intelligence piece that we're not understanding in the relationship, or, what are kind of your views on that?
Okay, so I think it kind of, it is partly connected to what we were talking before about the way we avoid. The other thing is, there's a few things in this. One is we miss the signs because we're distracted, or we miss the signs because we're actually avoiding consciously, or we're avoiding conflict. We miss the signs because we don't see the emotions of the conflict or the difference as being valuable, so we dismiss them, if not disapprove of them. So we've got very good ways of compartmentalizing our experience and ignoring and denying what's going on. So that can be part of it. The other part of it is relationships in terms of intimacy and understanding intimacy comes into my room a lot. And there are two reasons why men and sometimes couples come into therapy. The two most common ones is that we're not communicating, or not communicating properly. And two, we're not having enough sex, right? They're the most common things that are coming into the room. Now, if we break it all down, which is what we kind of do eventually in therapy, is we're not communicating because we're feeling the negative emotions of our lives. We're disconnecting, or we're actually retreating from conflict or emotion. So we feel the distance. And depending on what kind of partner you're with, you end up with different patterns, or kind of what I call choreographed moves, right? Like a dance. So big generalization, so I'm going to use the genders as the difference, not always true, but generally speaking, if there's a problem in the relationship, usually the woman, if it's a couple, will see the problem first and will pursue their partner in some way and try and communicate. And the guy most often is distracted or avoidant and doesn't want to talk. And so there's a bit of a dance move where the woman is kind of creating the move and he's kind of retreating away. And so you get this distancing, and then you get the opposite. You get two partners who are always pursuing, always arguing, but not really hearing or listening. So you get these and we learn this from our upbringing, but also we develop it in our relationships. So if men aren't connected to that and they would rather avoid it and distract from it, they end up getting pursued, and they end up running away to some degree, or they end up fighting back maybe at times. So it kind of comes down to this expectation of what does it mean to feel vulnerable talk about differences safely and really challenge the values of your relationship moving forward. But you need to have conversations about it. And that's where I think the definition of intimacy is really important. Communicating obviously is part of it, but understanding the emotion and what it means to listen and to hear and to validate and to encourage those kind of negative emotions, not bad emotions, but negative ones, so they can be heard and understood. So I think men generally speaking, want to avoid the emotional conflict, and they're worried about being judged. And sometimes that's what happens. There's too much criticism, judgment. There's this thing called the Four Horsemen. Have you ever heard of the Four Horsemen in relationships?
No, I haven't.
It's just part of the conflict style of couples. But these Four Horsemen of the apocalypse, it's been researched with these guys in the States called the Gottmans, the Gottman Institute. Amazing people doing lots of great research about relationships and why and how couples stay together. And they've looked at conflict and differences and reactions to conflict and differences. And the Four Horsemen basically are, the first one is criticism, so being critical or blaming. The second one is being defensive. The third one is sort of contempt, it's a high level anger, but also, put downs. And the fourth one, which is very common for men, is stonewalling. So when men are feeling something and thinking something, they're not sure what it is, but they're not saying anything. They shut down. So what we do in therapy is try and identify some of those patterns and work out what's happening underneath the sort of defensive response. And that's where we do a lot of teaching around understanding what emotional intimacy is about, that vulnerability is part of love. Loving somebody is not just hopefully it is all the fireworks and all the good stuff going off, but it's also about being vulnerable and being able to have space to sort of share some of those experiences with your partner. So that's why it's kind of interesting to look at what men are doing with their own vulnerability, you see, because it feeds into the relationship as well.
And how does a man, again, this might be me going back to what I was saying in terms of wanting some tangibility, in terms of how does a man make that step to be able to start improving his relationship and start improving and preventing these things from happening, right? Because oftentimes by the time we as men realize it, it's probably been going on for ages and it's probably close to too late.
There's a few things. It's a good question, because I think there's research about couples wait on average about 7 years before they get help, which is a long time. So there are 4 questions, and they're questions. They're actually quite easy questions, but you have to think about them. The first question, this is for a guy, for any partner, but for a guy, to sit down and think about if you can create the kind of relationship you want. What are the characteristics and what are the traits and what are the values? So if you can create the kind of relationship you want, what are those values, characteristics, and traits? Now, the question itself is about looking at your current relationship, maybe, but also where you want the relationship to go. The second question, which is related to the first question, is what do you have to do to create that relationship as well? So what is it that's about you that you know that you want to be able to kind of engage with your partner about to shift things a bit? The third question is, how motivated are you and what are your blocks? How are you getting in the way? And the fourth question is, what are you actually doing that helps your partner to feel like they're loved and appreciated? So those are 4 self-reflective questions. And, the questions of values can be, there's a long list of potential values that couples will talk about. They'll talk about connection, care, respect, fairness, acceptance, sexuality, sensual, kindness, fun, all the good stuff in terms of being in a relationship. And if you break those values down, even on your own, you can start thinking, okay, well, what do we do that fits that value? And how can we improve the value? And of course, you've got to talk about it with your partner. Those questions are kind of a container for a conversation. And you'll be amazed of how much that opens up actual possibilities, solutions, behaviors, activities that you can move your relationship forward. And it's an exercise. There's only 4 questions. but it can keep couples talking for hours potentially about how to keep checking in with your own expectations. I'm under no illusion, of course, that the reality for some men and some women is that maybe they're not in the right relationship, and despite trying everything they can, they may end up separating, of course. But for men that are in relationships, that they want to work it out, but they want to stay, those questions are fairly concrete, but they also open up all sorts of possibilities. Does that make sense?
Wow. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think that's excellent, because from what I'm understanding of those questions is that we kind of shift the ownership to be like, okay, it's not about what my partner's providing or what they're doing for the relationship, but it's like, okay, but what am I actually doing?
Yeah.
I understand all the characteristics and traits that I want to see, but what am I actually doing to actually enable that? Which is so big when we talk about the role that we play as men in relationships. Not always just about the partner, it's about us.
Yeah.
Those questions, I think I'm going to put those questions in the show notes as well, because I think those are excellent questions for anybody to ask themselves, with the hope that it's going to lead to conversation, because it's such powerful questions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing, I get people coming in, couples will come in distress, they're not happy, and their usual starting point is they've got a list of everything wrong with their partner. Literally. That's happened in my session. I've had people coming in with an A4 piece of paper with a list. This is what he has to do differently. This is what he's doing wrong. This is what she's not doing. We don't do this, we don't do that. And, that kind of conversation at the beginning of a couples therapy session is kind of interesting to see where people start from, but you don't get any resolution from that. You end up playing ping pong. That's the Four Horsemen: defending, attacking, blaming. So when you diffuse that and you start opening up the conversation, what is my responsibility in this relationship? How do I take responsibility to change part of it? How do we listen to each other well? How do we share these values that maybe we've lost? And let's work it together. So you're right. It's all about personal ownership and responsibility. Kind of has to be. Otherwise, you end up blaming the partner,
Exactly right. Oh, wow. This has been such an excellent podcast. I want to conclude it with one final question, and it's going to be a big question, but I think it'd be a perfect way to kind of tie it up. From your experience, as a man in this industry, doing what you do, which you're doing an amazing job in doing, for any of the men that are listening right now, what would be your number one piece of advice that you would give to any man that's listening in order to take that first step forward to improving their mental health?
The number one piece of advice. Whoa, what a question.
Big one.
Well, I mean, there's a few things that I say to men. First of all, you're not on your own. There are millions of men who struggle with the same thing. So you're not on your own. I think it's okay to be brave, to have a bit of courage, to seek out some more learning and understanding of yourself. It doesn't have to be therapy, by the way. I mean, whilst I have a bias towards counselling, it doesn't have to be counselling. There are some amazing resources out there, including what you guys are doing, to go and seek out information, go and connect with some of the research and do some reading or listening. And remember that your brain is always changing. It always changes. It's always possible to do things differently. And sometimes we just all need to be guided somehow. If it's not somebody, it could be a book, it could be a program, it could be a workshop, it could be, your favorite celebrity, it could be your favorite, it could be you two, it could be anybody. But start looking out there to see what's going on. Because when you look out there, you'll start to find the place to look inwards. And just give it a go. It's a courageous step, but there are millions of people doing it right now in this moment, changing. So join that community of change, I guess. It's important. We've come a long way. It's from my younger days to my parents' generation. We've come. I know we've still got a way to go. It's not perfect, but be brave and go out there, because there's lots of amazing things going on. So get connected.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way for us to kind of conclude with such powerful motivation and empowering steps for anybody that's listening. So I really want to just take this time to just kind of commend you, Howard, for just showing up, and your expertise is definitely shine through in this podcast. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thanks for having me.
More than welcome. And I think that for the men that are listening right now that want to connect and find a little bit more about what you're doing, even just anybody that's in the Melbourne area that wants to connect, or maybe in New Hampton, where can people find you?
So the website is where I get most of my referrals from. So it's menandrelationships.com.au. Or if you just put in men's counselling Melbourne, we're right on the top page of Google, which is pretty cool. So go and check it out.
Amazing. Excellent. I'll definitely put all those details in the show notes. If anybody's interested, please make sure to check that out. And
Brilliant.
for us guys, if you want to continue following what we're doing, you guys already know where to find us at Everything Nick and Femi. I appreciate you guys' all support. If you guys really love this, if there's something else you want to delve in, or you maybe want to do a part 2, please leave a review, comment down below. We want to create this podcast purely for you guys and to be able to serve. So I really appreciate you guys staying tuned if you're up to this point. You guys have an amazing week, and I'll see you guys in the next episode of Uncovered with